Hi, we're going to talk about bits. You don't get a lot of conversation about that because everybody assumes that everybody knows everything about bits. And what I found is not many people know anything about bits. They use what their trainer tells them or what their friends use, or they just find a good bit by accident. But you can actually look at a horse and tell what kind of bit he needs. You can, if you know something about bits, select a bit much easier for the horse and what he's doing wrong or right. The first bit that most horses are started in is a snaffle, mostly an O-ring type, but I don't like an O-ring. What happens with an O-ring, especially one that is a snaffle that has a straight side of the bit, is that this bit on a narrow lower jaw will pinch in and actually rise up into the horse's palate. So if you have a horse that is very low palated or small muzzled and you put this bit in, as you pull back on it and it hits his palate, the first thing he's going to do is root his nose out and gap his mouth open. He's doing that to get this peak out of the palate of his mouth. But why the O-ring doesn't work is when he gaps his mouth open, this O-ring actually can slide to the corner of his mouth and pull all the way through his mouth because of this angle right here. So instead of using a snaffle that has this kind of angle, you're much better off using a snaffle that has some kind of stoppature on each side, like this. This is a really interesting little D-snaffle that has a full cheek on the top, or a half cheek on the top, to support your headstall. So the bit will not rotate in the horse's mouth. This bit, when you pull, this ring can just simply slide around, and the bit will pretty much stay where it is, which makes people pull harder and harder and harder with this bit. Instead, if you have a bit that is stabilized by your headstall, like this, then when you pull this with the ring, see how the whole bit and the mouthpiece goes with it? So you can actually tuck a horse's head with this and get his nose where you can't get his nose. You actually lose his nose with that bit because he has to root out. This bit also has a beautiful curve in the mouth that lets it flow across the tongue and the gums. So if you're curving across the tongue and the gums, the bit cannot poke up into the top of the mouth. So can you see the difference? See the curve flowing across there? And see what happens there? How it peaks? So I would say avoid any bit that is a snaffle that has a straight portion of the snaffle, and avoid an O-ring simply to eliminate the bit not rotating properly in the horse's mouth and pulling through on the sides. There's several ways that this bit or others like it can work. Here's one. This is a bit that I invented about 35 years ago. This is a full cheek Western snaffle, and there is another company now making them, but for the first 30 years we were the only people that had this bit made for us. Full cheek stops and directs the corners of the horse's mouth, so there's less pressure that you have to put on the mouthpiece. These bits are for training, they're not for showing. So when you rotate your hands to pull that horse's nose around, this cheek is going to hit the side of his face and push on the side of his face instead of just simply pulling on his mouth. And there again, as you see, it's got a beautiful curve to the mouth. Now this is a little egg butt. Doesn't have much curve in it, but this egg butt is made in a 4 3/4 size. This is great for little colts that are small muzzled. The smaller the muzzle, the smaller the bit should be. The problem is, most of the time when you go to a store and try to find a bit, all you can find is a 5.5. So this is something that is really hard to find. If I owned it, I'd probably put it in a vise and hit it with the hammer in this portion to give that stainless a little curve. Speaking of which, why would you use stainless? Stainless is going to be with you a long time. It's not going to be anything that's going to wear out tomorrow. It's a very neutral mouth for the horse. Their favorite mouth and what feels good to them is just a cold rolled steel, mild steel. This actually, they even call it a sweet mouth because the taste of this steel after they've had saliva on it gives it a pleasant flavor for the horses. Copper, on the other hand, will actually soften a horse's mouth. Once you've softened it with this, you can put a stainless steel bit in his mouth, even if it's the identical bit, and it's like adding power steering to a horse. So copper is very soft. They like to use copper on mares a lot because they claim it reduces the heat cycle. I haven't had any experience with that, so I can't tell you for sure whether it does or not. Here's another bit that is a combination of both the others. Now this is a very thin little snaffle. You know, of course, that the thinner the mouth, the harsher it is on the horse. The big fat mouths are a lot easier. This little thin curved mouth is a Bradoon snaffle. That's what they call the little thin bits. It has nice little sprung out cheeks for your headstall. It's got rein loops here, but as you can see, this whole ring, when you pull it, will push against the side of the horse's face to direct his face, just not pull on the corners of his mouth. Once you get a horse out of a snaffle, and you really shouldn't ride a horse in a snaffle unless you're in a snaffle class, for more than 3 or 4 months, I've found. Once you do, and he starts rooting that nose out where you can't control it, the bit is so mild in the extreme that it's not going to pull his nose down. All he's going to do is root his head because it's easy for that mouthpiece to lay flat on his tongue. You can see what I'm talking about. If we took this horse's head and took this snaffle and put it in his mouth, if we were to pull back on this bit, see how it goes up into his palate? Now when it does, he's going to stick, he won't ride with it up and down. So he's going to stick his head straight out because that allows the bit to lay flat on his tongue like this and not hurt the top of his mouth. Okay? Speaking of these skulls, these particular 2 horses, the vet that gave these to me knew these horses when they were alive, and they actually showed 2 different shapes, mouths, and heights of muzzle and what bit these horses can take. This horse has a much higher palate right here. And when I asked her about it, she said, yeah, this horse had a little short, blocky little head and not a very small nose. So his nose came out kind of square. So he could take, actually, even though I wouldn't have used it on him, he could actually take a bit that had a straighter mouth like this. The smaller the muzzle, the more rounded a bit needs to be to keep from hurting him. That horse right there actually has a little small muzzle and a little narrow opening here. So he's got to have more rounded bit. So you want a bit that'll fall across it. There's a company called Myler, and they've been around now for about 30 years. And Myler was one of the first companies that came out with a bit that had an extreme curve in the mouth. I'm looking for that little bit. Look at how tiny and curved that mouth is. It isn't the width from here to here. It's the width across the curve here. This is going to be for a small muzzled horse. And these became very popular for colt training bits because of that shape. People didn't know why they worked. They just knew that they worked. The smaller the muzzle, the more curve you need to flow across the jaw. Okay? Now, after talking about the O-rings, D-rings, egg butts, your next step up is going to be what we call colt bits. Colt bits are going to have little short shanks, preferably shanks that angle back, because this is what most horses need. This angle back actually allows a horse to relax and put his head down. The straighter the cheek, which is why a Tom Thumb is a really terrible bit. A Tom Thumb has a very straight cheek right here. And so when it's being held up by the headstall and the shank is straight up and down, it actually pulls a horse's head up into this position because the weight of the shank is carrying it straight down. With this shank bent backwards, then the weight of the shank is actually letting the bit rotate like this, which is going to allow the horse to put his head down. So the straighter the shank, like on this cow horse bit, the more horse is going to lift his head up. If you're riding an Arabian bits are very straight here because they want this elevated head carriage. If you're riding a cutting horse, the more this bit goes back, the better. The lower that horse can put his head, the more he can put his eye on the cow. All these little colt bits will come in a variety, but the best ones are going to have little short shanks, a large ring for any training devices such as a martingale or something like that, or draw reins, side pulls, split reins are what you're going to have to train that horse. If you have a mouthpiece that has a good curve in it, you can have various things in the middle, like this is called a dog bone. It's actually not a dog bone. The proper name is a Bristol. It was invented by Dr. Bristol in about, I think late 1700s, early 1800s. And the Bristol, what it did, they were having those straight shank bits. And he didn't have a curve in his. So what he did is he put this little piece in the middle, so he had little straight sides here and here, but the piece in the middle gave it a curve. So the Bristol or dog bone is going to really curve a bit across a horse's mouth. That dog bone can come in any kind of shape. Here's a dog bone that also has some rollers. So if you've got a horse that likes to play with the rollers, these are copper. You know, it just gives him something to do and takes his attention off you telling him what to do. Here's a regular Bristol, and that bit is got a little longer shank, so this is going to be for a little bit more finished horse. Here's a Bristol that's got a very thick little mouthpiece. It's got inlaid copper. Again, that sweetens the horse's mouth and softens it a little bit. It's got inlaid copper on this roller. So you have kind of a roller and a dog bone combination. O-ring. An O-ring is slightly different. What this does is it works on the tongue. So it has the action of falling around the horse's mouth like a Bristol. But what it does, when you pull on the shank, the O-ring rotates down onto the tongue and causes the horse to lower his nose. If you have a horse that really hates anything in his port, maybe he's had a severe bit or he's had somebody with bad hands and they've hurt him, you can put an O-ring on and you will get the same kind of reaction as a ported bit. It will actually make the horse drop his head into your hand. And if you don't control the nose, you don't control the horse. A twisted wire, a wrapped copper, all of these bits are going to be than one of the smooth mouths. It's just whatever your horse will take. You should always start out with the less and go to the more. If your horse resents what you're doing, instead of going a lot of time to the more severe, back up another step. Go back to the bit that you were using before you did this. Go back to your O-ring and work him a little bit and see if you can get him through with it, because it might be a mental issue, not a mouth issue. So maybe he hasn't been in the snaffle long enough, or maybe he hasn't been in the short shank long enough before you start going to the longer shank. So back up one before you try more severe. Another bit is this one. This is a chain bit. In this case, this is a ball and chain. The chain allows the bit to flow across the mouth better than anything else. This is even better flow than the Bristol, than the Lifesaver. This is the bit that's got the most flow. So if you've got a horse that you really have to pull on, and you know you're going to have to pull on because his mind doesn't stay with you, you might want to go with a chain bit or a ball and chain bit. There again, though, I'd stay with the short shank until he wouldn't let you anymore. These two bits have rollers in the middle. And what this roller allows you to do is allows you to lift independent. Can you see that? If your horse drops the shoulder, you can reach down and grab one cheek, which cheek is the whole side of the bit, one cheek, and pull it up, which will lift that shoulder back out of the way. You don't want to work on both sides of the mouth when it's something like dropping a shoulder. If I'm not mistaken, the man that invented these roller bits was Billy Allen. This bit is a Dutton, and it has a very nice thin mouth where it won't put a lot of pressure on the tongue, and it has a little curve to it. And the benefit of that roller is that this bit also, even though it'll give you one cheek, it will not let this thing collapse like those regular snaffles will. You don't want a bit that can collapse. Okay? See the difference? So even after you go away from the O-ring training bits and the short shank, even in your longer bits, it's best never to go with a bit that can collapse around that lower jaw. There are very few horses out there now that have such bad conformations that they've got big, huge, blocky noses and a lot of room, thin tongue, and high palate that they can ride with that. Most horses we're breeding today simply aren't bred like that. This has a very short purchase here. The longer the purchase at the top, the more pressure the bit's going to put on the horse's face when you pull it back. So a good medium to short purchase is usually all that's necessary. There are a lot of bits that are so severe here that they need a longer purchase here. Before we talk about the rest of the regular curve bits and long shank bits, I want to show you these three bits, because these are kind of a combination between an O-ring or a D-ring and a snaffle. These are gag bits. And what a gag bit does, you want the same good mouth, but you want a bit that when you pull back on the shank, the horse can feel this thing rotating and rising in his mouth. It's going to lift that bit into his mouth, and as it lifts it into his mouth, it's going to tell him, I'm getting ready to ask you to do something. So you don't have to be as severe. It's not a sudden request. You're not saying, turn here. You're saying, you're going to turn, you're going to turn, you're going to turn there. I've got you and you're turning. It comes in a real small little cow horse style like this. That's great for your 2-year-olds. It gives them just a little bit of warning before the bit engages, before the bit lifts into their mouth to tell them what you want. This one has got quite a bit of gag to it, and this has a very extreme gag. You can see that you can really pull a long time before that bit ever engages in that horse's mouth. The bit that is probably the most misunderstood, at the same time the most needed bit in our riding today, in our Western riding, is a correction bit. Now, why do they call it a correction bit? They call it a correction bit because it corrects what this bit ruins. Whether it's in this shank or whether it's in a longer shank. These bits, when your hands are constantly engaged in that bit, pulling it back, and peek in the horse's mouth and soar the top of his mouth, what you're telling him is, when I pull back and this bit hits the top of your mouth, what I want you to do is roll your head out and gap your mouth open. That's what I want you to do. So that's what this bit teaches them to do. Because you should never use two hands. You should never pull a snaffle bit with both hands. It's not meant to do that. It's meant to direct one rein and then the other. If you pull back with both hands, collapse it against the lower jaw, you're going to teach the horse that what you're saying is, when the bit hits the top of your mouth, I want you to root your head out and gap your mouth open. And when you've done that, you've lost all control of the horse. So the correction bit, it's a 3-piece bit and will wrap around the horse's mouth like we've discussed. And it can have varying heights because horses' palates are varying. This is a little short correction here, and this mouthpiece is made for a reining horse. It's to keep his nose, and it's straight in the cheek, so it's to keep his head up and in your hand, and makes it very easy for you to direct that reining horse. That is a great reining horse bit because it doesn't hurt the horse. It corrects the problem you had about the horse gapping his mouth or taking his nose away from you. And with a straighter shank, really gives you a lot of contact with the one-handed reining patterns. The most used bit in this country, and properly so, is because a lot of people have found out that this does fix their problems. This is your colt correction bit. It has a medium port, and when the horse raises his head against this port, remember, it sits on his tongue flat like that. There's the headstall holding it, so his face is going to be in that position. Remember, the shape of the mouthpiece is going to direct where the horse's head is. So if this bit is being held on the reins like that, then he's going to have a pretty upright head position. He's going to be in your hand. You can control him. If you pull on the shanks, and he's used to that snaffle that is hurting him in the mouth, and he tries to gap his mouth, what's going to happen is, as he opens his mouth and rolls his nose out, this port is going to hit him in the top of the mouth. So instead of the port hitting him in the top of the mouth, when you pull back on the rein, this one is going to hit him in the top of the mouth when he roots his nose out. That's why it's called a correction. When it hits the top of his mouth, he'll close his mouth and bring his head down. He's like, oh, okay, so I'm not supposed to gap my mouth and root my nose out. I'm supposed to keep my head here. Got it. So this retrains him. And when you're using a correction bit, the best way you can use it is put the bit on the horse with the headstall, drape the reins across your arm, sit down in a chair or on a bench with your horse standing right beside you, and leave him alone. Let him feel the bit, and he will. He'll work his head up and down, and he'll go side to side, and he'll feel where that bit hits him in the top of the mouth. If you'll sit there for 15 or 20 minutes and drink your Coca-Cola, I'll bet you anything when you get on the horse and you give him his rein. And these are bits that you're not supposed to constantly keep your hands in their face. No bit is like that. You reward the horse for riding by letting him have slack, not constantly being in his face. And if you'll just let this horse carry this bit, and you just lightly pick your sides up when you want to turn, this horse will train himself to use this bit and keep his head in the proper position. This is the bit that we sell most commonly for older horses that people come in constantly and they say, oh my God, I've got an 8-year-old, you can't hardly stop him. He runs through the bit, he gaps his mouth, he sticks his nose out, can't control him. This has a very narrow little mouth, and this little narrow mouth will sit on those bars and work a little harder on those bars than that big nice fat bit did for the colts. It's got a longer shank, so you've got more leverage. And one of the things that people don't realize about these ports of any sort, whether they're a correction or a regular port, is that this gives the horse somewhere for his tongue to go when you're pulling back. When you're pulling back on this and this thing starts laying down on that tongue, he's got somewhere to put his tongue to keep this bit from pinching on his tongue. So any kind of port, whether it's a correction or a regular, can really have a beneficial result on a horse. This bit, on the other hand, you had better have a well-trained horse, and you had better have great soft hands. This is a rein cow horse bit or a vaquero bit. And this bit has very little tongue room. It has an extremely straight shank. So this bit is made for this horse to carry it in a very collected position, and your hands are going to handle on that loose rein, and you're going to be able to direct him like that, because he can't get away from any part of this bit. There's no tongue relief for it, and it's straight up and down and holding his mouth. So you better have a trained person and a trained horse with this one. This is a little colt bit. Again, this is a miler. It's got a very low port. It's got a nice wraparound mouth, but it's also got that Billy Allen roller in the middle to allow you to pick up those cheeks. That's going to keep that shoulder lifted when you go around the turns. If you do not lean into your turns, you cut the odds of your horse dropping a shoulder by about 60%. I've never had a horse that dropped a shoulder. My husband has never had a horse that kept his shoulders up. So how you ride your turns a lot of times will interfere with that horse and allow him to drop his shoulder. What's happening is that rider's weight is literally just throwing him off balance. And that throwing him off balance and not being in the middle of his back is why he'll drop a shoulder. Some horses are just notoriously bad about it, but most of the time it's the rider that causes the shoulder to drop. Here's the same bit. Now this is a correction, but this is a very gentle correction in that that little point right here has been taken off by that bit maker. So it works easier on the tongue. And any of your points of reference when you talk about a bit is going to hit a horse in several different places depending on what he can stand. Some horses don't like anything touching their palate, but that's only one point. You've also got your tongue, that it can work off the tongue like the Lifesaver. It's got the corner of his mouth, which is where your snaffles work, that and the bar. And then sometimes with your curb, you can work under the chin, or with your head stall, you can tighten them down or use steel head stalls and work on the crown. So those are all your points. And if you have a horse that won't work on one, don't say, oh my God, I can't ride the horse, he won't work on anything. Go to a different point. Say, well, if he won't work on the palate, then let's work on his tongue. If he doesn't want to work on the tongue, let's try the bars. So there are all these different places, the corner of his mouth, the chin, the pole, where you can work on all these places, and you can find a place that you and he can learn to communicate. All right, these are your curb bits. And a lot of people think that a curb bit, by its very nature, is a strong bit. The truth is, if you took this curb bit, which has a solid, unmovable mouth, And if you took this bit and put it in a 2-year-old and said, this is the bit I'm going to use to train my horse, he'd walk right through it. You could not control him. This bit has very little control to it. This is for a finished horse. Most curb bits are only going to work on the port. It's going to allow the natural hang of the bit in the headstall to hold his head in whatever position you want and let your reins control. So this is for a finished or trained horse. Now some of these curb bits will do things that others won't. I took a little break there and got something to drink and took my coat off so you're not seeing things. I was talking about the curb bits, and I was showing you first this curb bit. Now this has got a medium port. This medium port is good for a lot of horses. But if you have a horse that has an exceptional wide mouth here, or a wide tongue, or a thick tongue, he might need this wider mouth for this to sit exactly in the right place on him. And how do you find out if your horse does? Stick your fingers in the side of his mouth, open his mouth, prop it open, and look at his mouth. Look and feel his tongue. If he's got a big, fleshy, fat tongue, then he's probably going to have this wider port. Learn to look at your horse in the mouth and see what kind of mouth he's got. Feel with your thumb and see how high his palate is. If he's got a very low palate, don't put a high port bit in his mouth. Now, as that was a wide, here's one that has a narrow port. Here's one that has an extra wide port. So there are varying heights, but there's also varying widths. All the good ones will still have that beautiful curve that flows around that horse's mouth. Now this is an interesting bit right here, because this is a curved bit, but it's made for the horse that has problems with that shoulder again. So here's a curved bit that allows you to lift his mouth, and it won't pinch. And if you ever have doubts of whether something will pinch or not, stick your mouth on it and find out. Wrap your tongue around it and see if it pinches you, because if it pinches you, it'll pinch them. Now, if you're in a cutting pen, I am not a big fan of any bit that has movable cheeks, top or bottom. I don't want any cheek moving. I want a bit that is completely solid. That's going to stop the horse from having any distraction, because when you throw those reins away, if he can move his head and these cheeks are slapping back and forth, somewhere he'll cock an ear back saying, are you trying to tell me something? Are you the one that's moving that cheek? He won't understand that those cheeks are swinging just because he's working hard, moving that mouth. So if you're in a cutter, it's best to have a solid mouth bit. As far as it's in reining, it can be either way. In barrel horse, you're probably better off with a movable cheek on both sides instead of a solid bit. Although I think that it was Charmaine James that used a bit like this on Scamper. It just depends on what the horse will allow you to do with it. Now here's a curb bit, and this has a nice shaped mouth that will work well on most horses. It's called a 22, and it's got a little short cheek that, although it's not upright, it's not slanted a lot back. So this bit is going to give you a lot of control, but at the same time, it's going to be ready. You'll be able to lift it up quickly if you need to tell the horse to do so. These bits, all four of these bits, are what we call various cathedral bits. A cathedral bit is going to have an extremely high narrow port, and it is a control bit. This bit has got movable cheeks and a high port, and this has got a little slant back to lay on the tongue and lay on the palate. So what this is going to do is going to give you extreme control that way and that way. The benefit of these cathedral bits is if the horse has been trained by a man and he's a big powerful man, and then you're going to put this little kid or this pipe stem armed girl on him, you're going to have an equalizer. This horse has been jerked around by the mouth by some 200-pound plus guy, and he may not listen to the hands of that little kid or woman. This is your equalizer. When this bit is in the horse's mouth, she can control him because it's putting pressure on his palate and his tongue and his bars in this case because it's got a movable mouth. And you say, well, how can something like that fit in a horse's mouth? Well, you've seen these horses. Look at the length of this horse's head. Remember, a bit does not stand up in a horse's mouth. A bit lays like that on a horse's tongue. So wouldn't you say that if a horse with this long a head could get this bit in his mouth, that it probably wouldn't hurt him? Well, I can put this bit in my mouth. So if it'll fit in my mouth and lay on my tongue as short as my tongue is, then you know good and well it's going to be fine in a horse with a tongue that's that long. So it's not scary. If it doesn't work, then you just simply probably mean that you need a different pressure point in place. But this is great control to get that nose in a horse that's had some hard hands while he was in training. This is another type of cathedral. It's got the Billy Allen roller in the mouth, and what this bit is going to do is give you those cheeks and let you lift that shoulder. So this not only applies pressure to the palate here, but it also lets you get the shoulder.